Hi, this is Charu,
And this is Hannah.
and welcome to a three-part series called This Is Me, where we will be scratching the surface of stereotypes, our cultural identities, and representation in the media as Asian Americans.
All right, so last episode we played We're Not Really Strangers, where we got deep and personal. And kind of to continue that trajectory, we wanted to talk about growing up in two different cultures and how that has affected who we are. And so in part one, we'll be talking mainly about the various stereotypes that we have come across while growing up in America.
So, to start off the conversation, our first main thing is going to be stereotypes. So, what stereotypes have we faced growing up here?
Um, I'm gonna start off with some like really general and common ones. I think like the very like stereotypical and surface level stereotypes that I can think of is like with regards to education, like we're expected to be good with math, science, and then we're supposed to become a doctor or a lawyer or business or computer
Or an engineer,
science.
yeah.
Yeah, and then like another expectation is for us to be like on the top of the class, straight A, 4.0, and like
Yeah.
all these good grades and all of that. And like with extracurriculars, it's like we're an orchestra or band, and sports like swimming
Or martial arts.
and martial arts. Yeah. And okay, I can keep going. Let me stop there first so that you can have some input.
No, I mean, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that, that those are some of the most, like, generally when you think of an Asian or East Asian or Indian, that's kind of the mindset that you have because that's how we're
Mhm.
portrayed in film and media.
Yeah.
That is something that we could go really deep into, I think, how just different cultures are being portrayed,
Yeah.
except we did not plan for that, so we will not do that today. I don't think.
We can
We
if we have
can, we
enough
can if
time.
we have enough time,
Yeah.
but we'll see. But I think that's kind of what we're portrayed as the
Mhm.
smart goody two shoes who don't really do anything
Yeah.
bad. And if we do something bad, it's like extremely looked down
Yeah.
upon. And that's not how we all are. Like,
Yeah. We're
not
seen
all.
as like portrayed as the nerdy type.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
nerdy kid who wears glasses, like,
Yeah.
which,
And who have bad social skills.
yeah, exactly, the
Yeah.
awkward nerdy kid.
I mean, probably this pandemic hasn't helped my social skills
I
at
know.
all, but
Yeah. But I mean, it's not like, yes, those may seem like positive stereotypes that, oh, we think of you guys as smart, or we think of you guys as like able to accomplish things, but that leads into this idea of a model minority, which is something
Mhm.
that I'm sure many have come across, that terminology of a model minority. And to define it, it's basically a minority demographic whose members are perceived as achieving a higher degree of socioeconomic success than the population average, thus serving as a reference group to outgroups. So
Mhm.
basically, Asian Americans are seen to be more successful, and I'm putting that in quotes here, to
Mhm.
be seen to be more successful and thus are set as a model standard for other communities and cultures who are uh, around them, basically.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a good thing to have.
Mhm.
And there was a recent video that was uploaded by John Oliver, who is the host of Last Week Tonight on Asian Americans, and he did a really good job of diving into this idea of a model minority and how it really originated and what
Mhm.
it really means in the context of an entire society. Um, I think I need to go back and rewatch that video to like fully grasp it all because there was so much depth and information into it.
Mm.
But I would highly recommend that one to anyone
Mhm.
who's either been in this, like, in that position of being an Asian American, or just wants to learn more about what the model minority myth is about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another definition, I guess more detailed, I found this on, I found this on an article. I don't remember the title, or it was a source of an article. But it says like the model minority myth is where we're seen as having positive traits such as being seen as hardworking, industrious, studious, and intelligent people who have elevated their socioeconomic standing through merit, persistence, self-discipline, and diligence. The model minority construct is typically measured by the level of educational attainment, representation in white-collar professional and managerial wait
Managerial.
my brain's not working. Okay, occupations and household income. And something that also fits into that is like hard workers who don't quote unquote rock the boat. And like it goes back to what you said with stereotypes where we're seen as the goody two shoes, non-confrontational, don't want to stir anything up, make sure we stick to the rules and make sure we don't cause any
trouble.
yeah
Simple terms. And I think the other like very simple definition is, we're just people who put our head down and do the work. And not really question whether it's right or wrong. We just kind of do it.
I think that's like the main thing why the model minority myth is so prevalent is because in our cultures we don't speak up against it until now, right? Now we've seen so many people come out and speak about it because it's an issue that needs to be addressed too, right? But like keeping our heads down low is something that feeds into like this myth that continues to exist.
Yes. And I think, I'm not to like defend this myth or anything, but that idea of keeping your heads down and just kind of doing the work, I feel like that just is the way that our previous, like our great grandparents and like great great grandparents and just like our ancestors, is ancestors the right word? I guess so, ancestors, but they don't, I feel like from way back in the day, that's kind of been I feel like that's how they thought was the right way to make it somewhere in life or like to succeed, was to keep your head down and not cause any trouble, because trouble meant getting, beaten or getting fired or whatever. And I think that's just like continued to be ingrained into even like, immigrants who came in during like the 19 whatever, mid to late 1900s, and like that's kind of been ingrained into our society, and only now, like I feel like millennials
or I
or
wouldn't
Gen
say
Z,
millennials or Gen Zs. I think it's more of the general Asian American population who have experienced, I guess, the two different cultures, and then they see the difference between this keeping your head down low versus not.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's not a certain generation. It's just as a whole. Yeah. And it's like this whole idea that it's like, it's not a good thing that this that this exists, because it hides the fact that, there's large income gaps and that there's stereotypes that overlooks in individuals, like, just because someone has like maybe, despite someone having higher academic standards, maybe they have a learning disability or something that others are ignoring and aren't paying attention to, but are maintaining that same academic expectation, or undermining achievement through means of comparison to others who are, maybe doing more. But or this also just ignores the realities of subtle racism and discrimination. And it's something that needs to be brought more and more into light.
Yeah. I think, especially with like undermining achievements, people can just put a label, be like, oh, it's just because they're Asian that they could have accomplished this, right? It's not like, oh, they probably didn't have to work as hard. It's just because they're Asian, they were able to do this. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think another stereotype that we haven't touched on yet is food and language. Those are very big parts of our cultures.
Yes.
Yeah, very big part. I think for me, for my experiences with this growing up, my parents would make us dinner, and then we would bring the leftovers as lunch the next day to school, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember people thinking that it smells and it looks gross or weird.
Yeah.
And then I know like some people get the questions of like do you eat dogs, or these like abnormal things to be eaten and all of these things. And yeah, and then yeah, I don't really remember too much.
Yeah. I'm in the same boat as you with the food. Like the only instance, not instinct. The only instance where someone really questioned my food was when I was in third grade, and this was a second grader. So, to be completely frank, like he probably didn't know what he was asking,
Yeah.
and like it doesn't really make like it's obviously not a nice question. So I had like my food, and it was like rice and this curry, and it was kidney beans, which we make kind of like a curry to eat with rice. And basically, he turns to me and he goes, "Are you eating mud?" And I'm just like, "No, no, I'm not eating mud." And I was like, I kind of explained to him, like, "No, this is a type of beans that I'm eating." And he was just like, "Okay." And then I just kind of moved away.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I was a third grader and he was a second grader. And I don't want to like use that. I mean, as like the after that instance, it never really happened again. Like I was never questioned about my food.
Yeah.
And I think I was just always like I felt conscious about the fact that my food did have an aroma to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would try to be, when I was opening up my container of curry, I would kind of open it really slowly so that like it doesn't all just like waft out all at once and cause annoyance to anyone, which is such a stupid thing to think about, especially because my mom's food is so good. But that I guess was something that I kind of subconsciously just did.
Yeah.
And then, but I think after a certain point, like people, they appreciated my mom's cooking, and if they wanted to try something, I would just let them try, and that like was kind of people were more interested in trying new things than like judging me for it. And I think that was an experience that wasn't food wasn't always a like stereotypical or negative thing in my experience.
Yeah. I think growing up, there's less stereotypes, or there's less judgment as we grow up, just because people are more aware and people are more curious, right? So like I have other friends who aren't Asian American, and a lot of them are curious about what I eat, right? So they ask politely. They're like, "Oh, what are you eating? I've never seen this before." Or, "Can you explain to me?" Or, "I want to try. Can you take me one day to go eat this?" And like that is something that I really appreciate. Like, okay, I'm just gonna go off on a tangent here. Like my roommate starting in freshman year, she's Caucasian, and I wasn't really worried too much about the cultural differences, but and especially in freshman year, we couldn't really cook, so food wasn't brought up as much. But I think it was very apparent our second year when we were living in an apartment where we could cook. And I would be eating something, and then she'll be like, "Oh, what is this?" I'll explain to her. And then if we go out to eat, like, she'll be really willing to try new things. And she was really willing to learn about my culture, which was really cool. Because when big things were happening in Hong Kong back like last year, or not even last year, last year? Wait, hold on.
I think
Last year.
last year.
A year and a half.
Yeah.
A year and a half, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't expect many people to know what was going on because Hong Kong isn't really a well-known area or country, or now not a country. But yeah, but for somehow my roommate brought it up and we talked about it, and I was so shocked, like good shocked, right? I was so surprised, and I was so glad that she took the time to listen to my perspective and how I felt, knowing that my parents are from Hong Kong. And yeah, okay, that was just tangent to go on about her.
We love supportive roommates.
Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, I think when you brought up the fact that, as we grew older, people were just more curious to learn more about the cultures. I also think, like, our high school did have a very diverse population, and it was very much Asian American. Like, there was a good majority of us who were Asian American, and I just think having that diversity already there probably decreased the number of like stereotypical interactions we may have had otherwise, I think. Possibly. I don't want to say it's like negligible, because that's not, I don't think that's true. But at least with the people that I interacted with, I didn't face stereotypical judgments.
Yeah. I'm going to add something that is not really related to food, not at all related to food, but kind of related to what you're saying, right? And I think a lot of times, kind of what you were explaining, where it was diverse, where we didn't really experience that many like judgmental comments or anything like that. But I think that's why you see a lot of Asian Americans gravitate towards Asian Americans as a community, right? Because I think one part of it is because we share a culture, a common ground, where we're not afraid that the other person is going to judge us for speaking another language, acting this way, eating this food, thinking this way, and all of that.
For sure.
Not going to say that we don't cross cultures and we don't have other different friends, but I think that's what we see more commonly, because for our comfort, kind of.
Yes, yeah. Yes, you're not wrong about that. I think, if I think about it, my closest friends, they're all Asian American.
Yeah.
And I think, like, I've always been like that, I think, except like elementary school, like no one really cared. And that was when I had like the most diverse group of friends. And then slowly it just kind of, okay, I know who my people are, and that's kind of who I'm gonna stick with. But yeah, and I think not along the same lines, food and language are two completely different things, but language is another really important thing in our cultures. And it's something that I'm really proud of, the fact that I can speak my mother tongue in a fairly fluent manner and can comprehend and communicate using that. And I think it's something that I'm really proud of, and I don't ever want to lose. Although I think my experience with language is kind of what I face when I go to India, where people are always surprised that both me and my brother can speak our mother tongue really well,
Mm.
because they expect us to only either be super choppy with it or just communicate in English. But when, someone asks us a question and we respond back in our language, it's like, oh, wow, you can actually talk to us the way that we, our kids talk to us, kind of. And so that's been something that, it's something that, like, at that moment it makes you feel really proud, like, oh hey, we're like beating the odds and whatnot. But when you think about it, it's like kind of sucks that it's like, okay, just because I was born in America doesn't mean that I can't speak your language. And it's like all thanks to our, both mine and my brother, like our parents, that we are able to communicate that, because they instilled that into us from a very young age
Yeah.
and continued that into our uh, childhood and like adolescence and whatnot. We'll, I think we'll go a lot more into language later on.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll save my part on that for later.
Yeah. But on the flip side, sorry. On the flip side, I think here, whenever I think we get the, anytime I like, happen to have a conversation with my mom on the phone when I'm like surrounded by other people who aren't otherwise Indian, it's always like, oh, what were you like? What language was that? And I'd be like, okay, this is the language. And then the next question is always like, can you say something in that language? I'm just like, it doesn't work like that. And that's always like such an awkward question, because I'm like, the language just escapes me, and I'm like, no. And like,
Yeah.
it's the language that I speak a language called Saurashtra, which is already not a very common language in India. It's from a very small group of people, and it's very difficult to explain to them what the language is, because it's not the common Hindi or Tamil, which are more popular. And so it's just really interesting trying to navigate that, but it's something that, again, I'm proud of, so I don't mind it when people try to ask nicely
Mm-hmm.
to learn more about it. I think
Yeah.
it's just the way that they ask you is what really makes the difference.
Yeah. I like 100% agree with that, because I also speak a not so common form of Chinese, I would say. Because people automatically think Chinese Mandarin, like you speak Mandarin. But I speak Cantonese, which is um, a lot of people or it's the main language of Hong Kong, and then some other regions of in China, but mainly in Hong Kong. But it's a really rare language nowadays, and I am so happy whenever I find someone who can speak Canto. It's like I call them my Canto buddy, and it's so like it's so fun because like there's another level where we can understand each other. But more on that later for me, because language is very tied to my cultural identity, I think. So we're gonna be talking about that later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, can I go on about
Mhm.
okay. So I'm just gonna go on about something very specific to, I would say, East Asian stereotypes and East Asian not upbringing, East Asian stereotypes. And one of them is not really labeled as much now as this, called yellow fever. I think a lot of people in the Asian American or the East Asian American community knows about what it is. So it's basically, here's a definition that I found in an article by from a professor at UCLA, where it says, it is defined as a sexual fetish rooted in racialized and gendered stereotypes most commonly held by white men for Asian and Asian American women. Such stereotypes include an assumption that Asian women are quiet, shy, submissive, and conformist, while also being viewed as exotic and different. So it's not saying that like any Caucasian male dating an Asian woman has yellow fever. No, it's talking about the intention behind it, right?
Yeah.
So yellow fever is based on objectifying and sexualizing Asian or an Asian American woman. And that's actually something that was also brought up this past year when we are talking about Asian American and how and Asians and how especially Asian and Asian American women are fetishized. It wasn't something that I knew of until or recognized until this year when there was a lot going on in the Asian American community. Um, and thinking about it, I do have some experience with that. And it's just very like interesting to put a label to it, right? And it can come across as very creepy. One example that I've had is when I was working, my name tag just had my first and my first name. Well, why did I say it like that? First name and last initial. So I remember there was this one customer who came in, and I think he was frequent. I don't remember, but he asked me. He was like, "Oh, are you new here?" Because I guess he hasn't seen me working there before. I'm like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." And he was like, "Oh," and then he started making conversations with me. He was like, "Oh, what does the W stand for your last name?" I was like, "Oh, my last name's Wong." And yeah, and then he was like, "Oh, that's cool. Where's that from?" I was like, "Oh, that's my parents are from Hong Kong, and so my last name is from Hong Kong." And I think I just stopped it at there because I did not want to go too much into personal detail because I just found it really weird.
Yes.
And then he kept asking questions and just kept going and wouldn't let it go. And I'm like, "Oh, I need to help other customers." And then he would also look really weirdly at me and creepily at me. And I was like, I'm getting really uncomfortable by this. I need to go somewhere or do something else right now. But good thing my manager was like, "Hannah, I need you back here to do something."
Yeah.
So yeah. That's one of the more creepy experiences that I've had. Others were more subtle. Yeah, so that's one that's specific to East Asians. Another is how our eye shape is almost almond shaped, where we have small eyes and pointed corners. And there is one way you can tell that someone's making fun of you for your eye shape is when people pull their eye corners out and almost making your eyes look like slits, basically. I mean, and that's something that's really bothersome because I myself already recognize that I do have smaller eyes, and my eyes did basically disappear when I smile, which I recognize. But I, for me, that's how I know when I'm genuinely smiling, and it's a sign of me being like, you can tell when my eyes are like almost gone. That means I'm happy or I'm smiling a lot. So yeah. And then another one that's came about this past year and a half. Has it been a year and a half? A year and
Yeah, it's been a year and a half, yes. Because it was
a year and a half.
Well, not, yeah, basically a year and a half.
A year and a quarter. A year and a quarter. Is COVID, right? And it brought about where people thought that COVID was brought about, or whoa, okay. People thought that COVID was brought about through East Asian, specifically East Asian people, no matter, or people who look East Asian, no matter where you're from, right? And that's what perpetuated a lot of the violence that was going on this past year and a year and a half almost. And I think it just brought up a lot of things that need to be thought about in relation to the Asian American community, the Asian American community and Asian community in general, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think if I was to or like talk about South Asian specific stereotypes, I think one of the ones that I personally have not experienced, but I have heard of, is people just assuming that if you're from, or if you have, I guess, like a South Asian sounding name, or you look distinctively South, people sometimes automatically assume that you're from India, which is not the case, because South Asia is not just India. There's 8 total countries, and I know people who obviously won't appreciate when you go up to them and be like, oh, what part of India are you from? Just based on, again, stereotypical characteristics. And that could be, there is a nice way to ask where you're from without one asking, where are you really from? Because that's not a very great question. Nor do you just assume that they're from India, because that's what comes into mind when you're a South Asian. And I think this ties back to languages, sort of. This isn't really, I don't know if I suppose it could be considered stereotypical, but just being asked like, oh, do you speak Hindu or do you speak Indian? It's like, those aren't things, honey. Like, I can't speak a religion. I can't speak Indian. There's so much more culture to our languages that it's like, it seems dumb that would be a question, but I can't, it's, anytime I've been asked that, I'm always just like, is this just ignorance? Or are you trying to do something? Like, it always just confuses me how that's the question that people get. Like, do you speak Hindu? Like, no, Hindu is a religion. I can't speak Hindu, or I can't speak Indian. Like, do you speak American? No. And so I think, again, but like, I don't know, I guess those are like they're not the most extreme stereotypes, and I think I'm very lucky to say that I haven't necessarily experienced them. As in, like, I haven't necessarily experienced very creepy or extremely hurtful stereotypical incidents that would make me feel very uncomfortable. And I think I'm very lucky to have not experienced that. So, yeah. Oh, and I guess, sorry. I think one more thing would be just the idea of an arranged marriage is also a very stereotypical, like, South Asian / Indian thing that's brought up. And again, it's something that, if the conversation is held in a very delicate manner, it could be a really good conversation. But I think it's really, like, the show on Netflix called Indian Matchmaking, like, that really highlights so many of the stereotypes that people have towards, like, Indian culture, and it just brings that up, and it's so uncomfortable to watch. But when it's on a platform like Netflix, it's obviously broadcasted to such a large audience who are not all Asian Americans, they're not all South Asian Americans. And when Caucasians are watching this, it's like, oh, this is the image that they get of what Indian weddings can look like, which is not always, like, yes, arranged marriages are a thing, but it's not there. It's so much more to it than what's displayed.
Yeah.
And it just, like, the conversation has to be held so delicately, and it's when that doesn't happen, it pisses me off. But again, this is not something that I've experienced, it's something that I've seen through various, like, influencers or YouTubers who have seen the show and have, like, had a conversation about it. And I watched the show too, and I hated every second of it. I watched it for the memes, because the memes were iconic, but it made me so uncomfortable that one, the show exists, and two, that it exists on such a large platform. And it irks me the wrong way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Media representation is a huge topic too. But we don't need to talk about it now. It's a huge topic, so.
Yeah, we could go on and on about it, but we'll save that for part 3 of this series.
Yeah, so this wraps up this episode, and thank you guys for listening, especially since this is a topic that's super important for us and for everybody around us to hear. So yeah, tune in next week for part 2. Bye!
If you have any questions for us, email us at rewritethetimespodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at Rewrite the Times.